The hat didn't fall. It was placed, slowly, almost gently, into the mud like it belonged there, like the street was some kind of altar and the town had gathered to witness a joke. The wind off the Missouri River came in sharp and damp, tugging at loose signs and carrying the stink of wet hides, tar, and whiskey. Spring thaw had turned the landing into a brown soup where boots sank and wagon wheels groaned like tired animals. Men laughed anyway. In places like that, laughter was a habit, something folks used to pretend hunger wasn't watching. A boy stood at the center of it all, maybe 13, maybe a little less, with sunburned freckles scattered across his nose. His coat hung too big on him, sleeves swallowing his wrists, and his boots looked like they'd been borrowed from someone who didn't need them anymore. He should have been running errands, chasing dogs, doing anything but standing in a ring of grown men. A moment earlier, he'd been wearing a small beaver felt hat. Nothing fancy, not a gambler's showpiece, not a preacher's pride, just clean. And in a river town like this, clean things drew eyes the way blood drew flies. Now he was bareheaded. The man who'd taken the hat was Garrick Slade. Folks didn't say his full name much. They said Slade, the way you might say knife. Not because you were afraid of the word, but because you respected what it could do. He had that tidy look some dangerous men carried, like they preferred their violence organized. Hair oiled, collar straight, revolver riding his hip like it had been born there. Slade had tipped the boy's hat off with 2 fingers, almost polite, as if he were lifting the lid on a jar just to see what was inside. "See," he'd said, holding it up so everybody could admire it. "You can always tell a green pup. They wear their hopes where the sun can see 'em." The circle of men, river hands, drunks, a couple clerks pretending to be tough, laughed like they'd been paid per sound. Somebody slapped a barrel. Somebody wheezed like a bellows. One man shouted something cruel and stupid, the kind of line a coward only says when he's surrounded by other cowards. The boy didn't reach for the hat. He didn't beg. He just stood there, stiff as a fence post, eyes dropping to the mud as if he already knew how it felt to lose something without making a sound. Then Slade lowered the hat and pressed it into the street, crown first, slow, and he gave it a little twist, grinding the beaver felt into grit until the brim sagged. "There," he said, voice light as a tune. "Now it matches your prospects." That's when the laughter really took hold, the way rot takes hold in wood. It spread quick. But behind the circle, under the eave of a warehouse stacked high with trade goods, an old man watched without moving. He was the kind of elder people ignored until the weather turned ugly, and suddenly everyone wanted his opinion. The riverman called him Baptiste Laroche, French-Canadian once, long back, voyageur, hunter, survivor. His beard was mostly white now, and his hands looked like the roots of an old cottonwood, knotted, stubborn, and strong. Baptiste didn't step in, he didn't shout, not because he approved, but because he'd seen how jokes like this sometimes ended. He just watched the boy's face and recognized something in it, that quiet pride a person has when there's nothing left to hide behind. The boy's name was Noah Pike, not Baptiste's kin by blood, but out here, blood wasn't the only thing that made family. Noah had attached himself to the fur men like a burr, and he'd stayed alive by being useful, fetching water, carrying messages, keeping his mouth shut. He lived on scraps of attention the way some men lived on whiskey. Noah had been promised a place upriver, and he was looking past the crowd now, past Slade's grin, toward the river, like he expected that promise to step out of the fog any moment. The sound of hooves came first, steady, unhurried, not the frantic clatter of someone running from trouble, the kind of approach that said, without speaking, the street would make room. A supply wagon creaked along behind 2 horses stacked with kegs and sacks and iron. Mud grabbed at the wheels like it wanted payment. The driver kept his eyes forward, pretending he didn't notice the human knot in the street. And then the rider came into view. Andrew Henry didn't look like a legend. No shining pistol grips, no theatrical swagger, just a broad, plain-faced man in a workman's coat darkened by travel. His hat was battered, his boots dusty, his hands rough. He could have been a miner headed to argue wages, right up until you saw the way he sat his saddle. There was something about him that made noise quiet down. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. Like men could sense he was the kind who made promises and then carried them like weight. Henry reined in. His eyes went straight to the mud, to the hat, to Noah's bare head. Then Henry looked at Garrick Slade. Slade's smile stayed on his face, but it thinned at the edges. He tilted his head, the way a man does when he wants the room to remember he's still in it. "Well now," Slade said, all casual charm, "if it isn't Mr. Henry, heard you were buying half the wilderness." Henry didn't answer the joke. He slid off his horse and stepped into the circle. The mud clutched his boots. He ignored it like he ignored men trying to bait him. He bent down and picked up the hat. It came up heavy with filth, brim drooping, crown misshapen. Henry didn't shake it out, didn't wipe it clean. He just held it there for a moment, like he was weighing something more than felt. Then he looked at Noah. "Put it on," Henry said. Noah hesitated. His hands lifted like he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch anything Henry held. Henry raised the hat to the boy's level, patient as stone. Noah took it. Mud smeared his fingers. He set it back on his head. The brim stuck to his hairline for a second before it settled. A couple men tried a weak chuckle, like they didn't know if laughter was still permitted. Henry turned back to Slade. "You're hired muscle," Henry said, voice low and even. "Not hired mouth." Slade's eyes narrowed. "You telling me I can't have a little sport with the help?" Henry didn't flare up. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just let the words hang in the air long enough for every man listening to feel the weight of them. "In my outfit," Henry said, "sport costs." For a breath, the street went quiet. Wind worried the boards. Somewhere overhead, a gull pied like a nail driven into wood. Slade's hand drifted, almost casually, towards his revolver. Just a suggestion, a question. Baptiste watched that hand the way you watch a snake's head, with respect and no illusion. Henry didn't move his hands at all. He didn't change his stance. He didn't rise to the invitation. He simply stayed calm, and in that calm there was something that made Slade's little gesture feel small. At last, Slade lowered his hand. "Fair enough," he said, forcing the smile back into place. "Didn't mean offense, just teaching the pop about the world." Henry nodded once, like he'd heard a man speak and decided it wasn't worth arguing with the wind. "The world's big," Henry said, "and you're not the part of it I'm interested in." That should have ended it. It almost did. Slade turned away, but as he brushed past Noah, he leaned in and murmured something too quiet for the crowd to catch. Noah's face went paler, like the words had reached into him and squeezed. Henry saw the change immediately. He didn't ask what had been said, not in front of men who collected weakness like coins. He just set a hand on Noah's shoulder, brief but heavy, and guided him out of the ring. Behind them, the laughter didn't restart. It didn't dare. It just dissolved into the muddy street, leaving only the sound of wind and the uneasy feeling that something had been promised back. Baptiste watched Henry lead the boy toward the wagons and thought not for the first time that there were two kinds of dangerous men on the frontier. The ones who enjoyed being feared, and the ones who didn't have time for it. Later on, when the river fog rose and the lamps along the landing burned like little tropped suns, Baptiste Laroche would tell the younger men why that hot rattered. He never claimed the thing was magic. Baptiste didn't trust magic. He'd seen too many fools use mystery as an excuse to stop thinking. But he did believe in something quieter than magic. He believed in what objects could become once a crowd decided they meant something. A hat could turn into a declaration. Not a fancy one, not a loud one, just a simple statement a person makes without opening their mouth. I belong here. I'm not hiding. I won't be reduced to bare skin and shame just because someone stronger needs a laugh. That was why Garrick Slade had chosen the hat. Not because it was worth money, but because it was worth attention. It was visible. And in a place like that landing, mud, whiskey, and pride, visibility was a kind of currency. Andrew Henry understood that better than most. He'd built his name in a world of contracts and ledgers, where men measured each other by what they could deliver and how steady their hands were when it came time to pay. Henry wasn't flashy, he wasn't a saloon hero, but he had the sort of reputation that traveled ahead of him. If he gave his word, he treated it like a debt. And that reputation was exactly why he'd been pulled into a new venture that didn't care about comfort, manners, or the rules that worked back east. Fur wasn't like lead. Fur was a gamble played against distance, weather, hunger, and other people's homelands. The men behind the expedition were partners on paper, but in truth they were three different storms trying to share the same sky. Manuel Lisa was the first. Thick-shouldered, hot-tempered, and built for command. Lisa believed discipline was a tool and pain was its handle. Men followed him because he got results, and because he carried his anger like a weapon that was always loaded. He didn't need to raise his voice often. His presence did it for him. Pierre Menard was the second. Smooth, connected, and always smelling faintly of ink and decent soap, even out near the river. Menard he'd charm a customs officer into forgiving missing goods and then ruin a competitor with a polite smile. He was the kind of man who understood that power didn't always need a gun. Sometimes it needed a signature. And then there was Andrew Henry. Not polished like Menard, not blazing like Lisa, just steady, plain-spoken, stubborn in a way that didn't announce itself until you tried to move it. Baptiste had been hired for river work because he knew water the way some men knew scripture. He could read a sandbar, smell a storm, and keep half-drunk laborers from killing each other over a handful of salt. He also knew when silence was the smartest thing a person could carry. Out there, a loose tongue could cost more than a broken rifle. The morning after the hot incident, the partners met inside a warehouse office that smelled of damp wood and beaver musk. Dust floated in the sunbeams like slow snow. Maps and route sketches lay on the table, hopeful mostly. Ledgers sat open like wounds. Menard was at the center of it, quill in hand, pointing out lists and expenses as if numbers could make the wilderness behave. "Our supplies are loaded," Menard said, calm and careful. "Once we push off, the river becomes our road." Lisa leaned back in his chair as if the chair owed him respect. "And the men become my problem." Henry didn't speak right away. He studied the ledger. He knew what missing items meant upriver. Down here, a shortage meant discomfort. Up there, it meant hunger, delay, sickness, and sometimes a grave with no name. Finally, Henry looked up. "You hired Slade." Lisa's mouth twitched. "I hired a man who knows how to shoot straight and look mean doing it. The river's full of thieves." Menard lifted one shoulder in a neat little shrug. "A guard is sensible." "A guard," Henry agreed, "not a bully." Lisa's stare hardened like iron cooling. Bully is just a word men use when they don't like being told what to do. Henry didn't argue the philosophy. He'd learned something about Lisa already. If you wrestled him for pride, you'll end up smelling like bear no matter who won. So Henry kept it simple. He put hands on a boy. Menard glanced up as if the word boy was an inconvenient detail. "The boy you've collected, Noah Pike? He's unofficial." Henry's eyes stayed steady. "He works. He keeps quiet. That's more official than some hired men I've seen." Lisa gave a short laugh. "If the boy wants to play trappers, he'll learn. The wilderness teaches faster than you do." Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "There's learning," he said, "and there's being made a joke." Menard tried to slam the conversation back onto safe ground, like a man guiding a wagon away from a soft shoulder. "We have bigger concerns," he said. "The route, the tribes, the British traders moving south, the beaver." Baptiste, standing in the corner with his cap in his hand, spoke before he meant to. His voice came out quiet, but it carried in the small room. "And the Blackfeet," he said. All three men turned toward him. Baptiste didn't enjoy being stared at. Attention often came with responsibility, and responsibility had a way of getting a man killed tired. But he held their eyes anyway, because he had seen enough river seasons to know when silence became its own kind of lie. "If you go far enough," he said, "you meet them." Lisa waved a hand as if brushing away smoke. "Everyone meets someone." Baptiste nodded. "Yes, but some meetings end with trade, and some end with bones." Henry's eyes sharpened a little. "Have you been that far?" Baptiste hesitated. He wouldn't pretend experience he didn't have. "Not to the Three Forks," he admitted, "but I have carried stories downriver from men who went. The stories don't come with laughter." Menard topped the table lightly with his quill. "We can't build an enterprise on stories." Lisa leaned forward, grinned sharp. "We build it on pelts and men who don't tremble at shadows." Henry looked back down at the ledger, as if checking whether courage could be counted in columns. In his mind, Baptiste suspected. Henry saw the landing again. The muddy hat, the boy's bare head, Slade's easy cruelty. And then Henry likely pictured what those small things could become once the river carried them into country where there were no crowds to intervene. Because an expedition didn't collapse from shadows. It collapsed from the wrong man believing they were the sun. Henry finally closed the ledger with a slow, firm motion that said the talking would end soon whether anyone liked it or not. He looked from Menard to Lisa, then toward the doorway where the river wind rattled the boards. "We push off," Henry said. "Not loud, not dramatic, just final." Lisa stood, already half out of patience, half out of the room. Menard gathered papers as if order could be packed and shipped like flour. And Baptiste stepped back into the corner shadow, his warning delivered, knowing full well that warnings didn't always change a man's direction. Outside, the river kept moving, indifferent and wide. And somewhere out in that wide unknown, Baptiste could almost feel the country waiting, like a closed fist waiting to see what it would catch. By the time the boats pushed off from St. Louis, the town was already shrinking behind them, rooftops and smokestacks dissolving into a smear of gray on the horizon. The Missouri River took over like it always did, wide and stubborn, carrying whole trees in its current as if they were nothing more than driftwood. The expedition moved in a long, straining line. Heavy keelboats fought the river's pull. Canoes slipped along the edges like quick shadows. And on the bank, men leaned into tow ropes, dragging the boats against the current with backs bowed and boots sliding in mud. It was endless work. The river didn't care about plans, contracts, or speeches. If you got lazy, it punished you. If you got proud, it punished you faster. Baptiste LaRoche walked a lot of those miles on the bank, rope over his shoulder, feet slipping in wet clay. He listened to the men complain the way you listen to rain on a roof, constant, sometimes soothing, sometimes a warning. The Americans grumbled about the Canadians mocked the Americans. The French-Canadian boatmen, voyageurs, moved like they'd been built for this river. Their strokes were clean, their timing was sharp. They sang sometimes, not because they were cheerful, but because rhythm kept a body working when the mind wanted to quit. The Americans, newer to this kind of travel, took it personally. They didn't like being outclassed, they didn't like being hungry, and they especially didn't like the feeling that somebody, somewhere, was eating better than they were. At night, when they made camp, the firelight showed everything the daylight could hide: chopped hands, blistered feet, and tempers stretched tight. A tin bowl of boiled corn could turn into an argument. A pinch of salt could become an insult. Pierre Menard tried to smooth things over with polite words and promises of future profit. Manuel Lisa solved problems with a stare and a voice that sounded like a threat, even when he wasn't trying. And Andrew Henry, steady, quiet, moved among the men like a nail holding warped boards together. Henry didn't talk much. He watched, he listened, he gave short instructions, the kind of man who didn't waste breath because he knew he might need it later. And then there was Garrick Slade. Slade made himself useful in the most poisonous way possible, not by hauling rope, not by fixing gear, not by keeping spirits up, but by finding the weakest person in camp and making sure everyone else noticed. That weakest person, most days, was Noah Pike. Noah had learned quickly how to survive around grown men with hard lives and softer morals. He kept his eyes down, he moved fast, he didn't speak unless spoken to. He tried to become invisible. But men like Slade didn't allow invisibility, not when cruelty was their entertainment. One evening, with camp settled and the river muttering in the dark, Slade sat near the fire cleaning his revolver. He used a rag that looked too clean for a camp like theirs, like he cared more about the shine of a weapon than the dirt on his hands. Noah passed behind him, carrying spare flints in a small pot, trying to reach the supply socks without drawing attention. Slade didn't even turn his head. "Boy," he said. Noah stopped so abruptly it looked like a string had been pulled tight. "Sir?" Slade flicked the rag once, slow and casual. "That hat of yours still fits?" Noah's fingers rose to the brim before he could stop them. The hat was cleaner now than it had been on the landing, but the felt still held a faint stain. Mud had a memory. "Yes, sir," Noah said. Slade finally looked up. Firelight reflected in his eyes like 2 coins at the bottom of a cup. "You know what hats are for?" Noah swallowed. "To keep the sun off." Slade let out a soft laugh, almost gentle. "That's what children think. Hats are for telling people you're somebody." Noah didn't answer. Not because he agreed, because he didn't know which answer would hurt less. Slade leaned forward a little. "So who are you, Noah Pike? Some little lord in rags? Some partner's pet?" "No, sir." "Then why do you wear it like it matters?" he asked, like he was sincerely curious. Noah's voice came thin. "It was my—" He stopped himself like he nearly stepped off a cliff. Slade's smile widened at the hesitation. "Your what?" he prodded. "Your dotties?" Noah's eyes flicked toward Henry's tent area, where Henry sat with a small book, ledgery supplies and making plans. It wasn't much of a glance, but it was enough. Slade followed the look, then turned back to Noah, amused. "Careful," Slade murmured. "Some gifts come with strings, and some men don't like seeing a boy walk around wearing a man's promise." Noah froze. The words weren't loud, but they landed heavy. Across the fire, Baptiste noticed Henry lift his head from the ledger. Henry's eyes tracked the scene. He didn't step in. Not yet. He was learning the shape of the trouble, the way a man learns a river's current before he commits to crossing. Later that night, the camp quieted. The men's snores rose and fell. The river whispered, and the stars looked cold and far away. Henry stepped away from his tent and walked to the water's edge alone. Baptiste watched him go. Then after a moment, Baptiste followed. Not to interrupt, but because he'd seen too many camps where silence turned into tragedy. Henry stood at the river, moonlight painting his shoulders pale. He looked like a man weighing choices that would cost him either way. Baptiste stopped a few paces back. "You see him," Baptiste said softly. Henry didn't turn. "I see a lot." "That one," Baptiste said. "He makes trouble to feel large." Henry's voice stayed low. "You think he'll turn on us?" Baptiste didn't answer quickly. He chose his words the way you choose steps on thin ice. "A man who needs witnesses for his cruelty," he said. "He always wants a bigger audience. He'll push until he finds one." Henry's gaze drifted downriver into darkness. Towards St. Louis. Towards everything he'd been before this. Baptiste's smell twitched. Wind watches too. For a moment, Henry almost smiled. It was brief and tired, like a match struck and snuffed. "I won't have him breaking the men apart," he said. "Not now." Baptiste heard the phrasing and understood what Henry didn't say. That the problem might have to be handled later, when the timing was less dangerous, or when the danger was so great there was no room left for poison.
We met John Coulter near the Mandan villages, where the earth lodges sit low and round like they've grown out of the prairie itself, and the smoke rises in calm ribbons as if the land is breathing slow. That place felt different from the river camps we were used to. There was a sense of people staying put, of roots sunk deep. Most of us, rivermen, trappers, partners with money in their pockets, never stayed anywhere long enough to feel that kind of steadiness. Coulter walked into our camp at dusk without announcing himself. No shouting, no waving, no "here I am." He just appeared at the edge of the firelight the way a wolf appears, quiet, certain, and already measuring every face. He was lean, sun-darkened, and stripped down to what mattered, not just in how he dressed, but in how he moved. No wasted steps, no wasted gestures. He carried himself like a man who'd learned that the world will kill you for being careless. His hair was long and tied back, his eyes sharp but not restless. Restless men are noisy, even when they try not to be. George Druler recognized him first. Druler had the kind of grin that could light a campfire on its own, and when he saw Coulter, he laughed like the dead had come back to settle a debt. "Lord above," Druler said, stepping closer, "I thought you were dead." Coulter looked at him the way you look at a familiar trail that's grown over. Still there, still real, but changed. Then he said, plain as day, "I was, just didn't take." Now, a few men chuckled at that, but the sound didn't sit right. It was the kind of line that might be funny in a saloon. Out there, it sounded like a warning wrapped in humor. Andrew Henry stepped forward. Henry wasn't the loudest man in camp, but when he moved, people noticed. He offered Coulter his hand, simple respect, no performance. "John Coulter," Henry said. Coulter didn't take the handshake right away. He looked Henry over the way a man looks at a river crossing, checking if it's safe, checking if it's worth the risk. Then he clasped Henry's hand, firm and brief, and let go. "You're Henry," Coulter said. "I am." Coulter's gaze slid past Henry to the supplies, the traps, the bales, the barrels, all that iron and effort, all that hope packed in wood and rope. Then his eyes landed, just for a heartbeat, on Noah Pike, sitting close to the fire with his battered hot pulled down low. After that, Coulter said the words nobody wanted to hear. "You're heading too far." Manuel Lisa, of course, chose that moment to push his way into the circle like a bull into brush. Lisa didn't like being told anything, least of all by a man who spoke like he didn't care who was listening. "Too far for who?" Lisa snapped. Coulter looked at him, and there was no fear in it, no respect either, just a kind of tired knowledge. "For men who want to come back alive," Coulter said. Lisa's mouth twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Alive is for priests, we're after Beaver." Coulter's face didn't change. "Beaver lives where men die," he said, like he was reciting something the land had taught him. Pierre Menard edged closer, careful as always, as if the right words might smooth over the wrong world. "You've been to the Three Forks," Menard said. Coulter's eyes narrowed slightly, like the phrase carried a taste he didn't like. "I have." Henry didn't waste time pretending. "We want a guide," he said. Coulter let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it remembered how. "He want a guide into Blackfeet country." "It's where the Beaver are," Lisa said, impatient. Coulter's gaze snapped to him. "It's where the Blackfeet are," Coulter corrected. "That's the part you should say first." The fire popped, the night air settled heavy. Even Slade, lounging near a barrel with his revolver, paused his slow cleaning, like he was listening for the sound of fear in other men's throats. Henry held Coulter's eyes. "Men say you know the routes," Henry said, "that you can keep a party alive where maps stop, because the map ends." Coulter looked Henry up and down again, and something passed through his expression, maybe respect, maybe pity. "You keep your word?" Coulter asked. Henry didn't hesitate. "Yes." Coulter nodded once, as if that answered more than one question. Then he said, "All right, I'll tell you what you're buying." He crouched by the fire, picked up a stick, and began drawing in the dirt. Lines for rivers splitting, a shape for mountains rising, open stretches where a man would be seen from miles away, timber where a man could be watched for days and never know it. He talked about the Blackfeet without turning them into monsters. He spoke like a man who'd finally learned that the worst danger isn't always the other person. It's your own arrogance walking ahead of you. He talked about trapping where the beaver were thick and the profit looked like salvation. He talked about men who believed courage meant refusing to retreat. He talked about arrows falling like sudden rain. And then in the middle of it, he paused. Not a dramatic pause, just a gap. A silence that showed where the memory still had teeth. Nobody rushed him, even Lisa held his tongue, and that alone told you how the room had changed. Noah stared at the lines in the dirt like they were a prophecy. His fingers touched the brim of his hat, slow and absent, like he was checking that he still existed under it. When Coulter finally finished, the circle around the fire was quieter than it had been when he started. The fire sounded louder now, and the night beyond the lodge lights felt closer. Slade broke the silence the way a man tosses a stone into still water. "Stories," Slade said with a snort. "Men come back with stories so they can feel special." Coulter looked up at him slowly. "You want special?" Coulter said, voice flat. "Go there." Slade's smile sharpened. "Maybe I will." Coulter held his gaze. "Maybe you should." That killed the little grin right off Slade's face. It didn't vanish, not completely, but it turned brittle, like ice he wouldn't trust. Later, when the circle loosened and the men drifted back to their bedrolls, Henry found Coulter near the river's edge. The Mandan dogs prowled in the shadows, sniffing for scraps. The water hissed against the bank, cold and steady. "We need you," Henry said. Coulter stared out into the dark. "You don't need me," he replied. "You need fewer promises." Henry's jaw flexed. "I've already made them." Coulter finally looked at him. "That's the trouble with men like you," he said. "You think a vow is a rope you can climb, but sometimes it's a noose." Henry didn't argue. He just stood there, taking it. Then he said, "Will you guide us?" Coulter's shoulders rose and fell in a long breath. "I swore I'd never go back," he said. Henry waited. He didn't push. He didn't bargain. He just let the question sit there, because men like Henry believed patience was part of keeping your word. Coulter's gaze slid toward the campfire glow.
By the time we reached the country they called the Three Forks, spring felt like a promise you couldn't cash. The mountains rose ahead of us with their peaks still stitched in snow, like old wounds that never fully healed. The wind came down off those slopes with a sharp edge to it, cutting through coats and confidence alike. And the rivers didn't feel like water, they felt like boundaries. 3 of them, Jefferson, Madison, Gallatin, running hard and cold, threading through cottonwoods and brush, meeting like 3 hands closing into one fist. The land held its breath around that confluence. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if sound itself might offend whoever truly owned this place. Coulter felt it most,
You could see it in his shoulders, the way he scanned the timberline and never let his eyes rest. He'd been here before, and the country had tried to kill him for it. Men like that don't forget. They don't get over it. They just learn how to carry it. Henry felt it too, though he carried it differently, not in his shoulders, but in the set of his jaw. He wasn't the kind of man who panicked. He was the kind who made decisions with the calm certainty of someone signing a contract, even when the ink was blood. We stopped a short distance upriver from the confluence and started building. A fort, Henry said. A small stockade, logs upright, gate hung rough, firing slits cut where rifles could find daylight. Some men grumbled. They wanted to trap. They wanted profit. They wanted to believe that courage could replace caution. But Henry wasn't building for profit, not first. He was building for time. Axes rang out in the thin air. Trees fell with heavy cracks. Men sweated through cold wind. We hauled logs, set them, braced them, packed gaps with smaller branches and mud. The work had a rhythm to it, and rhythm is a kind of medicine. It kept men from thinking too hard. Noah Pike worked like he was trying to earn a place in the world by sheer effort. He carried stakes until his arms shook, fetched water until his boots stayed wet, kept his hat pulled low as if it could hide him from the eyes in the timber. Every now and then I saw him touch the brim, the way a man checks a wound through bandages. Slade worked too, and that surprised some of the men. He swung an axe with smooth efficiency, and for a while his jokes grew fewer. Even a bully can sense when the wilderness doesn't care about his reputation. When the walls finally stood and the gate swung shut for the first time, the fort felt like a small, stubborn thought carved into a huge, indifferent mind. It was something at least. A line in the dirt. A place to stand when the world wanted you moving. But a fort also does something else. It makes men feel safe enough to get foolish. Within days, talk turned back to trapping. The men had debts in their heads. They saw beaver pelts like salvation stacked in a pile. They'd come too far to sit behind logs and stare at trees. Henry didn't want it yet. He wanted scouts. He wanted time to read the land, to watch the patterns. But you can't keep hungry men idle for long. Idleness rots courage from the inside. It turns into whispering, and whispering turns into mutiny, or worse, recklessness dressed up as bravery. So Henry allowed a small trapping party to go out. Coulter took the lead. Droulard went with him, confident as always. A few others volunteered, men with more appetite than sense. And Slade, after a pause that drew attention, Slade volunteered too. Noah, of course, wanted to go. He hovered near the gate like a dog that thinks if it stands close enough it'll be taken on the hunt. But Henry stopped him with a look. "You stay," Henry told him. Noah tried to speak, tried to offer usefulness, tried to argue his small body could carry more than it already had, but Henry repeated it once more, firm and final. Noah stayed. We watched the trapping party vanish into brush and timber, swallowed by the country like it had been waiting for them. The gate swung shut. The fort went quiet, and the quiet felt crowded with what might come next. That night inside the palisade, the air felt too small for the fear sitting in it. Men cleaned rifles that were already clean. They sharpened knives that could shave hair. They checked powder pouches like prayer beads. Somebody told a joke and forgot the ending halfway through. I sat near the gate carving notches into a stick, an old habit, counting days. Noah sat nearby, drawn up small, hat brim low. He didn't speak much, but he watched the cracks between logs like he expected eyes to appear there. At one point he whispered, "Do you think they'll come back?" I didn't lie to him, not fully. "Some will," I said. He swallowed. Then he asked the question he really wanted answered. "He will try," I said. That is sometimes all a man can offer. Near dawn, fog pooled around the fort so thick it felt like you could reach out and grab it. The sentry's boots scuffed on the platform above the gate. Somewhere beyond the wall, a branch cracked. A man coughed and immediately hated the sound he'd made. Then a shape ran towards us through the mist. The watchman shouted. Rifles came up all along the wall, hammers cocked. Men surged to the gate, and for one heartbeat, the fort felt like it might explode outward with fear. The gate opened just enough. John Coulter stumbled in. Mud and blood streaked his clothes. His breathing was hard and ragged, but his eyes were sharp. Wide, yes, but focused like a blade. Behind him, the fog looked thicker, like it was hiding something with hands. Henry grabbed him by the shoulders. "What happened?" Coulter swallowed once, hard. "They were waiting," he rasped. "Not hunting. Waiting." Menard, who had been trying to keep his courage arranged neatly like papers, stepped forward, face pale. "How many?" Coulter's gaze flicked toward the timberline. "Enough." Henry tightened his grip. "And the others?" Coulter's eyes didn't soften. If anything, they hardened into something like shame. "Gone," he said. "Droulard. Gone. 2 others. Gone." Noah made a small sound behind me. Not a cry, not even a word. Just a breath that didn't know where to go. Henry heard it. He didn't look back. He didn't give fear a stage. He just ordered. "Inside. Everyone. Now." Men rushed like ants to a broken nest. Barrels rolled. Rifles were stacked along firing slits. The gate slammed shut. Wood groaning under the bar as if it knew what it was being asked to hold back. Coulter leaned close to Henry. I didn't catch every word, but I caught enough. "They saw you building," he said. "They know you're here. They'll test you. They'll bleed you." Henry's face went still, like a lake freezing. "Today?" he asked. Coulter's eyes stayed fixed on the fog beyond the walls. "Or tonight," he said. "Or when you think they've forgotten." And then, as if the morning needed one more stone laid on the pile. Night in Three Forks country didn't settle the way it did back downriver. It didn't drift in, soft and gradual,
It dropped, sudden and heavy, like a door slammed in anger. One moment, you still had the last bruised color of dusk on the mountains. The next, the darkness pressed against the palisades so hard it felt like the logs were listening. Inside our little fort, the men tried to pretend they weren't afraid by doing what frightened men always do. They stayed busy. They patched roofs that didn't need patching. They cleaned rifles that were already clean. They argued about food as if arguing could make more of it appear. And every time someone laughed, it came out too loud, too sharp, like a broken thing. Even Menard, who used to look like he belonged behind a desk with clean sleeves, worked his hands raw hauling firewood. Blisters rose on his palms like proof he was still real, like pain could buy certainty. I sat near the gate with Noah Pike and watched the fort turn into a kind of instrument. Green timber popped and groaned. The wind found every crack. Every little sound had a shape, and in a place like that, sound felt like a warning. Noah barely moved. His hat was pulled low. Every now and then, his fingers drifted to the brim like he was checking that he hadn't been stripped down to nothing again. Henry kept moving. He went from post to post, quiet and steady, speaking low to each man on watch. Not speeches, just small instructions. Look here, listen there. Don't waste powder. Hold your fire unless you see something real. The sound of his boots on packed dirt became, for some of the men, the closest thing to comfort they had left. Coulter didn't move much at all. He stayed near the firing slits, eyes trained on the black line of timber beyond the riverbank. He watched the night like a man watching a snake hole, calm, focused, and never surprised that something could come out. And hanging in all of it was the empty space where Garrick's Slade should have been. Missing men are dangerous in their own way. They make you imagine what's walking around out there with your name on it. The first sign we weren't alone didn't come as gunfire. It came as sound. Near midnight, a thin whistle slid through the dark, high and reedy like breath through a hollow stalk. It came from across the river first, then, a moment later, from upriver, then behind us somewhere in the brush. 3 calls, spaced apart, answering each other. Men froze. One of them muttered a prayer and looked ashamed of it the instant it left his mouth. Henry raised a hand, palm out, steady as stone. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. No shots, he told them. Not unless you see a body and a weapon. We will not waste powder on shadows. Powder was blood out here. You spilled it too early, you paid for it later. The whistling came once more, closer, and then stopped so suddenly the silence rang. The fort felt smaller, like it was shrinking around our fear. Menard found Henry near the center fire, voice shaking despite his effort to keep it smooth. "This is madness," he said. "They're circling us. We should withdraw while we can." Henry's eyes never left the darkness beyond the walls. "Withdraw where?" "Downriver," Menard insisted. "Back to the villages. Regroup. Return with more men." Henry turned his head just enough to look at him. "You're thinking like a merchant." "I am a merchant," Menard snapped, then caught himself as if he'd forgotten where he was. Henry didn't mock him. "And I'm thinking like a man who promised." Menard's face tightened. "Promised whom?" "Manuel Lisa. That man is safe in St. Louis. He won't bleed here with us." Henry didn't answer that right away. Pride sat in his chest like a stone he refused to spit out. He only said, "He'll come." Menard stared like he couldn't tell whether that was hope or insanity. Before the argument could go further, a shout rose from the far corner of the fort. Short, sharp, immediately swallowed by quiet. Movement. Rifles lifted. Hammers clicked back. Men surged to the wall. Henry moved fast but not frantic. "Where?" A watchman pointed towards the riverbank. Something drifted in the shallows. At first it looked like a log turning slowly in the current. Then it rotated, and pale skin flashed in lantern light. A face. Someone extended a lantern on a pole through a gap without opening the game. Warm light fell across the water and revealed a man's head and shoulders floating at a sick angle, clothing shredded, eyes open and staring up as if even death had been forced to keep watch. Not one of ours. A message, then. Not in words. In proximity. Menard's words came thin. This is barbarity." Coulter looked at him without sympathy. "This is war," he said. "You just didn't know you were in it." Henry stared at the corpse a moment longer than most men could. His face didn't twist into disgust. It settled into control, like a lid clamped down on boiling water. "Bring the lantern in," Henry ordered. "Close up. No one stares. We do not feed fear. But fear doesn't need feeding. It eats anyway." Later, when most men tried to sleep in shifts, Henry stood alone by the goals of the center fire. The glow lit his face from below.
turning his eyes into dark hollows. He looked like a man weighing choices that all cost the same. Coulter came to him quietly. "You're pinned." Coulter nodded once. "I know. You can't trap," Coulter continued. "And if you sit here long enough, your man will start inventing ways to die just to end the waiting." Henry rubbed a hand across his mouth. Exhausted. "What would you do?" Coulter's gaze lifted towards the black outline of the mountains. "I'd leave," he said. "Not downriver. West." Menard, passing nearby, heard the word and turned sharp. "West. Across the divide. That's suicide." Coulter didn't argue. Staying is slower suicide. Henry stared into the coals like he could read his next step in the ash. A man like Henry didn't like retreat. He didn't like admitting the land had outplayed him. His pride wasn't loud, but it was stubborn. And it had weight. Then the fort answered for him. A dull thump landed outside the gate, close enough that every man heard it. Men snapped upright. Rifles lifted again. Henry raised a hand. "Hold." A torch was brought. The gate cracked open just enough to slide the light out. There on the ground sat a bundle tied in hide. Henry stepped forward, slow and careful, and cut the tie with his knife. Inside was a beaver pelt, fresh, still damp at the edges, like it had been taken only hours ago. Pinned through the fur was a single feather, gray as smoke. Owl feather. Coulter's face tightened, like the feather had touched his skin. Menard whispered, "What does it mean?" Coulter stared into the dark beyond the torchlight. "It means they're here in the night," he said. "It means they can put a hand on you without you seeing the arm." The men didn't know what to do with that. They couldn't shoot it. They couldn't bargain with it. Henry reached down, fingers steady, and pulled the feather free. He didn't throw it away. He held it up, studying it like a contract written in veins. Then he spoke towards the timberline, not shouting, not pleading, just stating something into the darkness the way a man states his name at a trial. "We will leave," Henry said, and you can feel the whole fort exhale. Shoulders dropped. A couple men closed their eyes like they had been holding back tears and finally let go. Menard's relief hit him so hard it looked like pain. Coulter only nodded once, grimly, like he'd expected nothing else. But Henry wasn't finished. "Not yet," he added. "Not like rabbits. We leave on our terms." That pulled the air tight again. A reef turned back into tension. But it was a cleaner kind of tension. Purpose, at least. A line drawn. I watched Henry in that moment and understood something about him that night made plain. The fort wasn't just logs and mud and sweat. It was Henry's vow hammered into shape. He built it with his hands and his pride. And he wasn't going to let the wilderness decide how he abandoned it. Outside the walls, the darkness stayed quiet. Not because it was empty, because it was listening.
2 days after that owl feather warning showed up at our gate, the fort got its own kind of answer. The gate creaked open just enough to let a man through, and for a heartbeat, nobody moved. We all thought it might be another trick, another message tossed at us from the trees. Then the figure stepped into the torchlight, and it wasn't a ghost. It was Garrick Slade. Alive. He walked in slow, like he wanted us to see he wasn't afraid, but the truth was written all over him anyway. His coat was torn at the shoulder. There was dried blood on his sleeve. His face looked thinner, like the wilderness had scraped him down and left the sharp parts behind. He held his hands out, palms visible, the way a man does when he knows every rifle in the yard is pointed at his ribs. "Well," Slade said, trying to sound easy, "you boys look like you've seen a ghost." No one laughed. Not even the men who used to laugh at anything just to hear noise. Andrew Henry stepped forward, eyes hard. "Where are the others?" he asked. Slade's mouth twitched. "Dead," he said, almost like he was talking about weather, or close enough. John Coulter came a half step closer, and I noticed his eyes weren't on Slade's face. Coulter watched hands. He watched belts. He watched the places a man hides what he really is. "Where's Droulard?" Coulter asked. Slade hesitated, just a blink too long. "Didn't see him die," he said, "but I didn't see him live neither." That tiny pause hung in the air like smoke that won't clear. Even men who weren't smart could smell something sour in it. Pierre Menard tried to keep the talk civilized, like manners still mattered inside a log box surrounded by enemy country. "How did you escape?" he asked. Slade shrugged. "I ran. That's what a man does when he wants to keep breathing." Coulter's voice sharpened. "You ran where?"
Another flicker of hesitation. Downstream first, Slade said, then through timber. I hid. I waited. Coulter stared at him a long moment, as if choosing whether to kill him now or just remember the shape of him for later. Smart, Coulter said, flat. Or lucky. Henry stood there doing a different kind of work, quiet arithmetic, not numbers on paper. Risk, hunger, powder, the danger of keeping a snake inside your bedroll versus the danger of throwing a gun hand out into the cold when wolves were already close. In the end, Henry didn't let Slade off easy, but he didn't shoot him either. You'll be watched, Henry told him. You'll eat, you'll rest, you'll work, and you'll keep your hands to yourself. Slade dipped his head like a gentleman, of course. But when he turned to walk deeper into the fort, his eyes slid towards Noah Pike. Noah sat near a stack of wood fire, hat pulled low, trying to be small. Slade's gaze lingered on that hat, just long enough for Noah to stiffen. Then Slade looked away, like he didn't care. That night, the fort settled into uneasy sleep. The wind moaned through the log gaps. Men shifted in bedrolls and woke themselves up. The kind of sleep you get when your body is tired, but your mind refuses to believe it's safe. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a soft scuffle near the supply corner. The sound was careful, too careful. My hand went to my knife before my eyes were fully open. A shadow moved by the cornmeal sacks. Then the lantern light caught a face, and my grip loosened. It was Noah. He was crouched over the sack like a guilty animal, hands dusty with meal. His eyes were wet and frantic. Before I could speak, he whispered, "It's not me. Someone's been taking it. I needed to see how much is left." He wasn't stealing. He was counting, the way a child counts matches when he's afraid the dark will last longer than the fire. I tied the sack shut again, pulled Noah away from the corner, and in that moment we moved like thieves ourselves, because telling the truth in a hungry camp feels like stealing peace. When morning came, Henry checked the supplies personally. He didn't rely on a clerk. He didn't rely on hope. He counted. And when he finished, his face darkened. Menard hovered nearby, trying to offer explanations. Perhaps a miscount at loading, he started. Henry didn't let him finish. "No," he said. "It's been taken." The word taken is different from lost. Lost is accident. Taken is choice. Henry's eyes drifted across the fort yard and landed on Slade, sitting apart, cleaning his revolver like always. That revolver had become his prayer, his comfort, his excuse. He walked straight over. "Did you take food?" Henry asked. Slade looked up like he'd been insulted in a parlor. "You think I'd steal from my own outfit?" Henry didn't blink. "I think you do what you thought you could get away with." Some of the men nearby shifted, drawn to conflict the way cold men lean towards flame. Slade's smile sharpened. "I've killed men for less than that accusation." Coulter stepped in without raising his voice. "Then kill him," Coulter said. "See if that fills your belly." For a second, it looked like Slade might reach for his gun just to prove he still could. But even Slade knew something had changed. This wasn't St. Louis, and Henry wasn't a boy to be laughed at. Henry stayed calm, and that calm was heavier than any threat. "You're not in a saloon now," Henry said. "You want to live? You follow rules." Slade forced him off. "Yes, sir," he said. But it didn't sound like respect. It sounded like a promise made through teeth. That afternoon, Henry gathered the men. He didn't call it a speech. He didn't dress it up. He simply told them what they were going to do. "We leave at first light," Henry said. "West, across the mountains." You could feel the fort inhale, then choke on the idea. Menard stepped forward, voice tight. "West? We can retreat downriver." Henry shook his head. "Downriver is open ground. It's pursuit. West gives us terrain. West gives us water they don't know like Coulter does." Menard's face tightened with fear and stubborn pride. "And if we die in the mountains?" Henry's answer was simple. "Then we die moving." Menard stared at him like he was looking at a man choosing the wrong door in a burning building. Then something in Menard shrieked. Not courage, exactly. More like practicality sharpened by panic. "I'll take a party downriver," Menard said. "I'll find Manuel Lisa. He owes us support whether he likes it or not." Henry nodded once. "Go." Menard looked almost surprised at the permission. "You'll let me leave?" "I won't chain men to my pride," Henry said. Then he pulled a folded paper from his coat and sealed it with wax. "Take this. Tell Lisa where we went. Tell him we have pelts and dead men, and that his investment is bleeding." Menard took the letter like it weighed more than paper. As Menard's party prepared to slip out, Noah approached Henry quietly. "Mr. Henry," Noah said. Henry looked down at him. "What is it?" Noah swallowed. "If we go west, will we ever come back?" Henry's gaze went toward the mountains, cold, pale, indifferent. "Maybe," he said. Noah nodded like that was enough, because out a question. Do you think Slade will come with us? Henry didn't answer right away. He glanced toward Slade, still apart, still polishing his gun as if it could wash him clean. Finally he said, if he wants to live. Noah's face didn't relax. That night, Menard's party slipped away downriver, quiet as thieves.
We left before dawn when the world still looked unfinished. The fort gate opened with a long wooden groan, and cold fog spilled in low across the ground like smoke. One by one the men filed out, packs hanging heavy off their shoulders, rifles slung close, breath puffing white in the dark. Nobody spoke much. Talking felt like tempting something to answer. Henry went first, with Coulter beside him. Coulter didn't need to look back. He walked like he already knew the land would shut behind us the moment we stepped away. In the middle of the line, Noah Pike kept pace as best he could. He tied a thin strip of rawhide under his chin to keep his battered beaver felt hot from blowing away. It was a small thing, just a boy's solution to a grown man's country, but it made him look committed. Like he understood this wasn't a game anymore, like he was holding on to the one piece of himself he refused to lose. Slade walked near the rear. He didn't swagger now. He watched. His eyes moved constantly, measuring the tree line, measuring the men, measuring distance the way hungry men measure bread. By mid-morning, the fort was gone behind us, swallowed by fog and timber, and the country opened up into hard ground and thin air. We climbed toward the divide through broken rock and scattered pine, over ridges where the wind hit so hard it stole warmth right through wool. The first days were brutal in that plain, honest way the early days always are. Blisters, sore shoulders, thirst, the kind of hunger that makes a man stare too long at a puddle. Pox seemed to grow heavier with every mile, not because the supplies increased, but because the men carrying them shrank. Henry kept us moving anyway. He didn't push like a madman, and he didn't let the line scatter. He set a pace that was slow enough to survive, but steady enough to stop men from thinking too long about what might be following. Coulter guided us off open ground whenever he could, choosing timber and broken terrain, places where eyes on distant ridges couldn't read us as easily. When he spoke, it was short and plain, like a man giving directions on a road he didn't want to remember. Then we reached a place Coulter called the Bad Valley. The ground changed under our feet. The air changed too, sharp, sour, carrying a stink like rotten eggs. Steam rose from cracks in the earth, thin white breath drifting between trees and stones. Pools lay scattered across the valley floor like strange mirrors, some clear enough to look inviting, others milky and bubbling, their edges crusted in yellow mineral. Men gagged. One muttered a prayer and then looked around as if ashamed anyone heard it. Noah stared at the steaming ground with wide eyes. He whispered something, half a question, half a fear, like he'd stepped into a story people weren't supposed to live through. Coulter didn't smile. He never did in that place. The earth's just breathing, he said. Don't step where it looks thin. We crossed carefully. Boots crunched on mineral crust. Every step became a test. Men placed their weight slow, feeling for weakness, like old man on a rotten porch. One of the trappers edged too close to a pool, and the crust gave with a soft crap that sounded small but felt huge. He yelped and jerked back just in time. The heat kissed his boot, and leather smoked. The smell hit us all, scorched hide and panic. He stared at his boot like it had betrayed him. It tried to take my foot, he said, voice thin. Coulter looked at him with a kind of calm that doesn't comfort. It takes whatever you give it. Slade, somewhere behind us, let out a brief breath of laughter. Barely a sound, more like he couldn't help himself. Then he swallowed it. Even he could feel it. The valley didn't care about jokes. That night we camped above the steaming ground, on higher rock where the earth cooled and the air didn't burn the nose, but the smell still drifted up, faint and wrong. Steam slid between the trees below like slow ghosts, and the wind made odd noises through the stone cracks, almost like whispering. Men slept badly. They turned in their blankets and woke themselves, convinced they'd heard footsteps that weren't there. I woke once to hear Noah murmuring in his sleep. Not words you could understand, just the sound of a boy trying to fight something he couldn't name. I leaned close and shook him gently. He snapped awake with a gasp, hand instantly grabbing at his hat like he needed to make sure it hadn't been taken again. It's a dream, I told him. Noah swallowed hard. I dreamed Slade took it, he whispered, and everyone laughed. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Some thoughts don't want daylight. By morning, the climb got worse. Snow still clung in shadowed gullies. The wind grew crueler, and men's lips split until they bled. A couple of the trappers started to look at Henry with that old question in their eyes. What did you bring us into? Henry didn't answer with speeches. He answered by rationing. Food grew tight. Cornmeal stalks shrunk. Dried meat became crumbs scraped carefully into a tin plate. Men chewed slow and quiet, as if eating too fast might make the hunger notice them. And that's when the smaller kind of danger crawled back into the open. Theft. One evening, while most men were distracted, I saw Slade crouch near the packs. He moved quick and practiced, the way a man does when he's stolen before. His hand slipped into a pouch, took something small, jerky by the look of it.
and hid it inside his coat. My fingers tightened on my knife. Every part of me wanted to stop it right there, to pull the poison out before it spread. But Henry was trying to keep men alive through country that could swallow all of us, and sometimes leadership is choosing which fire you can put out, and which one you have to let burn a little longer. I told Henry later, quietly, away from the others. "Slade steals," I said. Henry's jaw tightened like a trap snapping shut. "Are you sure?" I nodded once. Henry stared across the camp at Slade's back for a long time. Then he said, low, "Not now." I didn't like the answer, but I understood it. A man can only fight so many battles at once, and the land was already fighting us every hour. A couple days after that, we saw riders on a far ridge, not close enough to see faces, just silhouettes on horseback, still against the sky like cutout shapes. Watching. A cold ripple moved through the line. Men tightened their grips on rifles. Someone muttered, "How many?" as if numbers could fix it. Coulter didn't panic. He just adjusted our route, steering us into thicker timber and broken ground, away from open slopes. He told Henry, "They're probing, seeing if we scare easy." Henry's reply was simple, "We don't." That night the riders returned, closer this time. Not close enough to fire, not close enough to speak, just close enough to remind us they could choose the distance. Leaking like wolves around a camp. A shout echoed faintly through the trees, a voice we couldn't understand. Then laughter, brief, distant, and gone. It wasn't friendly laughter. It wasn't even mocking in the usual way. It sounded like part of the hunt. Noah flinched so hard his shoulders jumped. His eyes went wide beneath the hat brim, and for a moment he looked exactly like he had back in St. Louis. Small, surrounded, and waiting for someone stronger to decide what he deserved. I watched him, and I hated that sound more than I hated the gold. We built our fire small that night, and sheltered it with rocks. Men spoke in whispers. Some didn't speak at all. The dark felt close enough to touch. Slade sat at the edge of the light, face unreadable, like he was enjoying the way fear made everyone quieter. Or maybe he was just counting his chances, the way a gambler counts cards without moving his lips. Henry stood with Coulter near the tree line, both of them staring toward the ridge through gaps in branches. Smoke drifted between them. Neither man looked like they...
We reached the canyon on a day that looked clean and harmless from a distance. Up close, it was anything but. The river ran through that narrow cut like it was late for an appointment, cold, clear, and violent. The banks were steep, slick stone that didn't offer much footing, and the current tugged at anything that touched it like it was alive. Even the air felt sharper there, as if the canyon itself narrowed your breathing. Coulter took one look and frowned. "Bad place," he muttered. Henry studied the water and the rim above it, eyes moving slow, calculating the way he always did. "We have to," he said. So he did. Men stepped into the river with packs held high. The shock of icy water hit them like a slap. Some cursed, some didn't waste breath. Boots slipped on round stones under the surface. Bodies leaned into the push of the current with the kind of strain you feel in your teeth. Baptiste grabbed Noah by the sleeve and guided him in. Noah's hat was strapped under his chin, rawhide biting into skin, like he was afraid the wind would steal even that. The boy didn't cry out. He didn't complain. He just stared hard at the far bank and moved one careful step at a time. Half the brigade made it across. Men crouched on the far side, shivering and dripping, trying to breathe around their own fear. Others were still midstream, fighting the water. And then the first shot cracked from above. It wasn't close enough to see the shooter, just the faintest puff of smoke on the rim and the sharp report echoing off stone. A bullet slopped into rock near the waterline, showering chips and sparks. Everything that had been hard work became panic in one heartbeat. Men ducked midstream. Packs dropped into the water. Rifles jerked up toward empty sky. The river didn't slow down for fear. It kept pulling. Then arrows started falling, dark streaks cutting through the air, thudding into packs, into wet earth, into flesh. One man cried out as an arrow caught him, and he stumbled backward into the current. He flailed once, eyes wide, then the river took him like it had been waiting. Blood opened on the surface and thinned fast, swept away like the canyon was wiping the evidence clean. Coulter fired upward from cover, calm and controlled, smoke curling around his face. "Move," he shouted. "Don't bunch up." Henry shouted too, not with panic but with command. He pointed men into gaps, forced them to keep momentum, kept the crossing from turning into a pile of bodies. While Baptiste dragged Noah behind a rock outcropping for cover, Noah whispered Henry's name like it was a prayer that might become real. And then out of the corner of my eye I saw it. Slade. Garrick Slade wasn't pushing through the river with the rest of us. He wasn't taking cover and firing. He wasn't helping anyone. He sprinted away from the crossing, scrambling up a side path along the canyon wall. For a half second I thought he was retreating in fear. Then his movement looked too purposeful. He wasn't running from the ambush. He was running to it. I yelled and Henry heard. Henry turned mid-command, eyes snapping to Slade's fleeing back, and you could see the understanding hit him like a fist. A leader shouldn't chase a traitor in the middle of an attack.
A leader stays and holds the line. But Henry was more than a leader in that moment. He was a man with a vow lodged deep in his chest, and Slade had been cutting at that vow since St. Louis, stealing food, poisoning trust, and now he was trying to sell all our lives for his own skin. Henry handed his rifle off without hesitation and ran after Slade. Coulter shouted something, maybe a warning, maybe a curse, but Henry was already climbing. His boots scraped wet stone, his hands grabbed roots and ledges. He moved like a man who decided it didn't matter if he fell, as long as Slade didn't get away clean. Down below, Coulter kept the fight from collapsing. He fired when he had a shot. He barked orders. He shoved men forward. He covered the crossing like a gatekeeper holding back a flood. Baptiste kept Noah low behind the rock, body angled protectively, eyes scanning for arrows. The boy's hat stayed on. That thin rawhide strap held it tight, as if the hat itself understood it couldn't afford to be lost now. Minutes stretched like hours. Then we heard a single pistol shot above us, close and sharp, not like the distant rifle crack from the rim. For a heartbeat, the canyon seemed to pause and listen. And then Henry's voice, rough with effort, rang out, not a scream, but a shout you make when you're wrestling something heavy. The crossing continued in bursts. Men scrambled up the far side, soaked and shaking. The last man clawed out of the water and collapsed to his knees, coughing, hands trembling. Coulter and Baptiste fired a few controlled shots to discourage pursuit, smoke rolling low in the cold air. Then the arrows stopped, and the canyon fell into a strained quiet. The river roared on, indifferent. We stood there, wet and battered, staring up the side path, waiting. Finally, footsteps slid down the rocks. Henry appeared at the top of the slope, breathing hard. A shallow cut marked his cheek. His hands were empty of weapons, and that alone told me he'd done what he needed to do up there. Behind him, dragged by the collar like a sack, was Garrick Slade. Slade's revolver was gone. His cheek was swollen. Blood ran from his lip. His eyes were wide with furious disbelief, like he couldn't accept that the world had refused to admire him. Henry shoved him forward, and Slade stumbled to his knees on the far bank. Coulter stepped closer, rifle ready. What did he do? He asked, voice flat and deadly. Henry's chest rose and fell, breath steaming. He was signaling, Henry said. He had a piece of polished tin, like a mirror, flashing from the ridge, calling them in. Slade spat blood and tried to sound proud. You don't understand, he rasped. They had me. They would have. Coulter didn't let him finish. So you traded, Coulter said, not even angry, just certain. Slade's eyes flicked toward Noah and away again, like even now he couldn't help checking whether the boy was still small enough to hurt. I did what I had to, hissed Slade. A man lives by his wits. Henry stared down at him. His voice stayed quiet, and somehow that was worse. A man lives by what he leaves behind, Henry said. No sermon, no lecture, just a tired fact. Then Noah, who had been held back by Baptiste, stepped forward, small fists clenched, shaking but stubborn. The boy's voice trembled, but it came out clear. You can't take it. Slade turned his bloodshot eyes on him. What take? Anything, Noah said, fingers brushing the hat brim like a shield. You can't take it. For a heartbeat, I thought Slade might lunge, even without his gun. Some men didn't need steel to be dangerous. Henry stepped between them instantly, like a wall. Coulter asked the question everyone was afraid to answer. What now? Henry looked around, the canyon, the rim, the timber beyond. He looked at the wounded men shivering by the water. He looked at Slade on his knees. Then he made a decision that didn't feel like justice and didn't feel like mercy. It felt like the frontiers in cold arithmetic. We can't drag him, Henry said. And we can't keep him. Slade's face drained. You can't. Henry crouched close, voice low enough that only a few of us caught it. You'll walk back the way you came. Alone. No gun. No food from us. Slade whispered.
Weeks later, after the mountains had taken what they wanted from us, after the cold, the hunger, the long nights where the wolves watched our fire like patient creditors, we finally stumbled out of the timber into lower country. The air felt different down there, softer. Not friendly exactly, just less sharp. The trees grew taller, the wind didn't cut as deep, and the men, what was left of them, moved like ghosts who hadn't decided yet whether they were grateful to be alive. We were fewer, leaner, quieter. And we still carried the pelts. They were bundled tight and tied with rawhide, heavy on our shoulders, damp along the edges like proof that the whole ordeal hadn't been a fever dream. Those bundles didn't feel like profit anymore. They felt like a receipt the wilderness had stamped with blood. Noah Pike walked with a limp from a twisted ankle. He didn't complain. He just kept going, jaw set, hot on his head. That hat wasn't clean anymore. It had been soaked and frozen and dried again. It smelled like smoke and sweat and river water. The brim had a crease where an arrow had grazed it, so close to his skull I still felt sick when I thought about it. But it stayed on his head. When we finally met Manuelisa again, it wasn't in a grand reunion with handshakes and speeches.
It was on a gray river morning near a trading post that smelled of wet wool and horse sweat and old wood soaked in smoke. Lisa stood on the bank with armed men behind him. He looked like he always did, solid, impatient, built out of will, the kind of man who treated danger like an inconvenience. But when he saw Henry's party come out of the trees, he didn't smile. He didn't joke. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, just a moment, something like respect tried to push its way through his usual hardness. He stepped forward and called out, rough as gravel, "Henry, you look like the country chewed you." Henry stopped a few paces away. His coat hung on him like a tired flag. His face was lined with exhaustion that went deeper than sleeplessness. He didn't smile either. "It tried," Henry said. Menard was there too. He looked thinner than I remembered, the polish scraped off him by weeks of worry. He watched Henry like he was seeing a man return from the dead. "I found Lisa," Menard said quietly, as if confessing. "I told him. He said you were either dead or stubborn." Lisa snorted. Same thing, usually. Henry didn't take the bait. He only glanced at the boats, the supplies, the armed man Lisa brought. "You came," Henry said. Lisa's jaw worked, and he looked almost annoyed that the words he wanted weren't there. "I brought enough to pull what's left of you out," he said. Then he added lower, "and enough to keep them from thinking we're easy sport." Henry nodded once, like a man accepting a tool handed to him late. Then Henry gestured to the bundles. "We have pelts," he said. Lisa's men moved automatically, hands eager, eyes bright with the old hunger. In their minds, fur was still money, still victory, still the point. Henry lifted one hand. Just a hand, steady, calm, and final. And the men stopped. Lisa paused too, surprised. It takes a certain kind of authority to stop greedy men without raising your voice. Henry had that kin now, carved into him by the trail. "Not yet," Henry said. The wind moved through the pause. The river hissed. Nobody spoke. Henry looked at Lisa and said, low and controlled, "These pelts cost men. They cost time. They cost parts of us we don't get back." Lisa's expression hardened. "You think I don't know cost?" Henry didn't argue. He just said, "I think you count it differently." For a heartbeat, I thought Lisa might explode. Anger was his favorite language. But he didn't. He exhaled hard and gave a short nod, like he was forcing himself to listen. "All right," Lisa said. "Say what you need to say." Henry didn't make a sermon out of it. He didn't turn grief into theater. He simply named the dead. He named the missing. He named the moments where the whole venture could have collapsed into an unmarked grave. And as he spoke, the bundles at our feet seemed to grow heavier, as if the pelts themselves remembered the hands that had taken them. Menard lowered his gaze. I could see guilt sitting behind his eyes. Lisa stood still, jaw clenched tight, the usual fire in him dampened by the simple weight of names. When Henry finished, silence spread out like a blanket. Even the trading post timbers creaked softer. Lisa finally spoke, voice rougher than normal. "We'll divide what can be divided," he said, "and we'll bury what can be buried." Henry stared past him, toward nothing. "Some things don't bury," he murmured. Lisa didn't answer that. Maybe he couldn't. We stayed long enough to shift supplies, to tie bundles down, to do the practical work that keeps men from thinking too hard. Then we took to the river again, downstream this time, letting the current carry us. The boat moved easier now, but the men didn't. Some slept hard, then woke startled, hands reaching for rifles that weren't there. Some stared into the water like it might explain what the mountains refused to. Menard grew cleaner as we went, but the haunted look around his eyes stayed. Henry stood often at the bow, coat flopping, gaze fixed forward, like he couldn't afford to look sideways at memory. Noah sat near me more than once, quiet, watching the current. The hat stayed on his head, not because he made him somebody, because he made him feel whole. Eventually the smell returned before the town did. Tar, hides, whiskey, mud, St. Louis, loud and busy and pretending it was civilized. The landing looked the same as ever, and that felt like an insult, like the world had taken nothing seriously. Henry stepped off the boat and onto the muddy street where this whole thing had started, months ago, with a hat in the mud and a crowd laughing too easily. Noah stepped down beside him, hat on, limping a little, alive. People stared at us, some muttered greetings, others avoided our eyes like guilt was contagious. A few men, the kind who live on porches and